The dictionary defines supernatural as an invisible agent that transcends the laws of nature, something that exists beyond the observable universe. On one hand, science tells us seeing is believing. There's a prosaic, material explanation for everything in the universe, and it's only a matter of time before we discover it. On the other hand, science is fundamentally based on the ability to observe things, document, and repeat them. How exactly then does one understand things so rarely seen? Can you see consciousness? Can you measure dreams, intuition, or love? Can you put God under a microscope? We've achieved great things. We've landed on the moon, we're probing interstellar space, we've mapped the human genome, and we're learning things previous generations probably never could have dreamed. But just because we think we have a pretty good handle on things, history's there to remind us that doesn't mean we actually do. We thought that witches could float just a few centuries ago. Women couldn't vote until 1920. These are barely ticks on the cosmic clock. Biologically, human beings still run on the exact same hardware. The only thing that changes is the input. It's the software. I think there's a reason you often hear people say things like, I should have been born in another era, or that person's an old soul. I don't believe we're bound by time constructs. Neither do I believe the old saying, you only live once. In fact, I think there's more evidence to the contrary. It's not a matter of wishful thinking or being naive. It's about opening yourself up to possibilities of things greater than yourself. Unfortunately, not all of us are willing to do that. And the longer you tend to hang on to something, the harder it is to let it go. It seems pretty apparent that the only time we're truly open to this life and all its mystery is when we're children. And tragically, as soon as we're barely old enough to grasp who we are, we're shoved into the race and an educational system that couldn't care less about individuality. We don't nurture what makes us different. It's only lip service. In reality, different still means you're going to have a harder time than most. And God forbid you experience something truly unexplainable. You'll be lucky to find a handful of people that'll listen, let alone believe a word of it. And what if those experiences don't stop? What if they're with you your whole life? If your will is strong, you might gain profound insight, but if it's not, you're trapped in a nightmare and you can't escape from it. Nobody has any answers for you. Some claims are so outrageous, so unfathomable, there's only one sect of humanity that'll listen. The others who claim the same things happened to them. Now, quite a few academics over the years have weighed in on the so-called alien abduction phenomenon, most notably the late Dr. John Mack. John was a tenured professor at Harvard who conducted a lot of research and interviews with alleged abductees. He wrote 2 books on the subject, and though he believed there was something very real about these claims, he never concluded that actual ETs were taking people, nor were they purely physical experiences, at least not all of them. Not surprisingly, he was investigated by his own university because they simply couldn't or didn't want to believe there was anything more than mental illness at play here. After nearly a year, they finally concluded that he wasn't violating any ethics or professional standards. So clearly, even being an esteemed professor at one of the most respected institutions in the world isn't enough. If your findings threaten the establishment's false sense of security, there's blood in the water and out come the sharks. What is it about the unknown that scares us so deeply? Well, when you live in a glass house, it only takes one stone on the right trajectory to shatter it into a million pieces. Welcome back to the Ether.
An unexplainable series of strange bright lights seen over the skies of Arizona gets a lot of people wondering what the heck they saw.
It's fucking branched off into 2, isn't it? Oh my god! If that joins up as a whole one again, I'm going to be freaked out. It's going together. What the hell is it?
What are your best guess at what that was?
That's a UFO.
Just adding and adding to the panic was this feeling of suffocation.
Were they behind me? Were they pursuing me? Or was around this tight curve that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead? Was I going to run into something worse?
Did he see the aliens?
He did not see me. But some of those guys on the shrimp boat might have if they'd have been smoking the same stuff.
What type of aircraft is it? Cannot confirm. No non-aircraft in the vicinity. Seems to be playing some sort of game. He's flying over me. It's hovering, but it's not an aircraft.
It's June 15th, 1991. Nadine and her friend Pamela are driving from California to Arizona for a hiking trip they'd planned. They're headed south on Highway 89A on a pitch-black, moonless night. It's about 20 miles south of Sedona. It's been a pretty long trip and they're exhausted. It's time to find a place to rest for the night, so they decide to stop at the next place they see. And they end up pulling into Banjo Bill Park in Oak Creek Canyon. It's completely deserted, nobody around, just a few picnic tables, a few grills, an old bathroom, the sound of the wind blowing through the trees, and a single dim light at the end of the dirt parking lot, so it's quite dark. Nadine and Pamela grab their flashlights and set up camp. They start a fire and chat for a while. The whole time, though, Nadine can't shake this uncomfortable feeling they're being watched by someone. They'll be sleeping in the van tonight, so they move all their personal belongings and gear from the van to the picnic table behind the vehicle. It's about 11 p.m. as they lock the doors and retire for the evening. Sometime after midnight, Nadine awakens to what sounds like multiple people walking around the van alongside of it. Whoever they are, they're close. She sits up, straining to try to hear these noises a little more clearly, and in a few seconds, the back door of the van suddenly swings open, activating the interior lights. And this blinds her for a moment, going from complete darkness to light suddenly, and as soon as her eyes begin to adjust, she sees a long, skinny, gray arm reaching toward her. The hand has 3 fingers, a thumb, and what look like little indentions at the end of each fingertip, almost like suction cups. Nadine loses consciousness. She regains it less than a minute later, finding herself standing outside the back of the van, barefoot in her nightgown. She's paralyzed. Her body is stiff, arms are hanging at her side, her chin's tucked down forcefully, so she's staring at the ground. The van door is still open, so it's illuminating the immediate area around her. And though she can only look down, she can see in her peripheral vision what she thinks are 2 large-headed, bald children in front of her. They're maybe 3 to 4 feet tall. Though she can't see it, she also senses a taller, much stronger presence nearby. Nadine has a good view of her feet, since that's about all she can really look at when they suddenly rise up off the ground, just 1 or 2 inches. She notices the children, one on each side of her, have their hands in a cupped position directly underneath her hands, except their hands aren't actually touching hers. She begins to slowly move forward as she watches the ground just passing underneath her feet. In the corners of her vision, she can now see other little children surrounding and following her. Deep down, she knows these aren't kids, but the thought helps to calm her frantic mind at the time. The ground becomes more illuminated as they approach an extremely bright light up ahead. She can feel several times something brushing across her face as they move ever closer toward this light. Nadine becomes overwhelmed by the thought of where they're headed and loses consciousness again. The next thing she knows, she feels the sensation of falling or being dropped from above back onto her sleeping bag in the van. She even feels her body physically bounce as a reaction to the sudden stop. Nadine looks at her watch. It's 3:30 a.m. In a panic, she has the worst feeling that whatever just happened wasn't a dream. Something about it had to be real. Nadine is terrified that whoever just took her is going to come back for her. She tries her best to wake up Pamela by shaking her and screaming at her to please get up, but she's completely unresponsive. Nadine then spends the rest of the evening just peering out of the back window until it becomes light out at around 5:30, at which point Pamela finally wakes. Still deeply shaken and unsure how her friend's going to react, Nadine only shares a few brief comments about the previous night as they sit outside and drink their coffee. Pamela has no recollection whatsoever of the events, but she does listen to her. They begin to pack up, and they notice of all the gear, all the belongings they brought and put out on the picnic table, only Nadine's personal bag is gone. It contains some clothes, shoes, a towel, nothing major, but it's nowhere to be found. They do their best to convince themselves an animal must have run off with it. Over the course of the next 6 months, Nadine finds herself oddly obsessed with moving to Sedona, Arizona. Though she doesn't even have the prospect of a job lined up and knows no one in the entire state, she relocates to Sedona and rents a house in a remote area in January 92. This opens Pandora's box. The events that follow and what they reveal to her are enough to plunge even the most well-grounded into complete madness. Stay with me. Nadine Lalich was born in 1952 and grew up in Lincoln Park, Michigan. She would go on to spend a 30-year career working as a paralegal before eventually retiring. But in May of 1991, 1 month before her trip to Sedona, she has a dream, except the dream is more like a memory from her childhood home back in the summer of '62. This isn't exactly clear until years later, but she goes to bed that night around 9 p.m. while her mom, dad, and brother stay up watching TV out in the living room. It's dark. Her family's still there on the couch, but they don't look normal at all. They're all slumped over, not moving, their eyes partially closed like each one of them is in some kind of a trance. The TV's also displaying that old universal off-air symbol they used to, accompanied by that static, droning sound. Pretty eerie sight. Being summertime, they usually kept the front door open and left the wooden screen door shut and locked. Nadine walks over to the door and stares out into the darkness, and there, hovering above her street, she sees a giant UFO. It's so large it extends over the houses on both sides of the road. And there's some kind of beam of light coming down from the craft. Nadine instinctively knows someone's coming to see her. A moment later, someone's standing on her front porch. She unlocks the door, holds it open so this visitor can enter, and they walk over to the kitchen where there's some light, and she sits down at the table. Her family's still there on the couch, but out of it. They're not moving. Who exactly did Nadine let inside the house? Well, oddly enough, it appears to be an elvish figure wearing a blue t-shirt, perhaps in an attempt to appear more normal. It's a male figure, short, stocky, and very strange looking. He has white skin, slanted eyes, large pointy ears, with a large pronounced mouth and thin lips. But apparently he's holding some kind of tubular instrument in his mouth. Nadine knows he's able to read her mind and see all of her thoughts. He knows she's suffering emotionally from past trauma in her childhood and asks her, telepathically, if she'd like to have her pain taken away. She's actually not afraid of him, but still in shock by his appearance, she doesn't respond. The being then places her wrist into his hand, moves it up to this apparatus he has in his mouth, and places his other hand on her head. Nadine feels a sudden shock that jolts her head backward, and she screams. She feels him entering her mind. It's incredibly invasive, like there's two people inside of her body. He can now see and feel every thought and memory she's ever experienced. He's somehow draining this emotional pain or absorbing it from her. After a couple of minutes, he withdraws his hands. Her head falls forward. The elf man is content with what he'd come there to do and rather abruptly just walks out the front door and disappears into the night. For the first time in her life, though, Nadine finally feels like someone else understands her. Just a few years later, in 1968, Nadine and her boyfriend Mike take a long drive out into the countryside of Metro Park, and that's short for Huron Metropolitan Park, one of their favorite spots. It's a little southwest of Detroit, along, of course, the Huron River, and just a few miles inland from the shores of Lake Erie. Parked on the side of a dark road, they notice a large metallic craft with a dome on top flying slowly overhead, about 100 feet across with colored lights underneath. The craft gently drops lower and flies ever so slowly directly over their car. Mike and Nadine aren't really afraid. They're more stunned and curious than anything else, so they decide to follow it. Several hours later, they both wake up in their car on the side of the road. They remember seeing the UFO and figured they'd just fallen asleep. At this point, they have no reason to really suspect any foul play. On the contrary, they're both excited to tell Nadine's parents about what they'd seen. They don't believe her. It'll be almost 40 years before Nadine recalls the events of those missing hours. Before we fill in those blanks, though, let's first revisit the 1991 encounter in Sedona. Quite a few years later, after a long string of unusual events, Nadine finally decides to attend a MUFON conference in Orange County, which leads to a session with Barbara Lamb in January 2005. MUFON, of course, they're the Mutual UFO Network. I'm sure a lot of you know who they are. But Barbara is also pretty well known in ufology circles. She is a licensed psychotherapist, hypnotherapist, and regression specialist. She works out of Southern California. We'll come back to Barbara and her line of work later, but this meeting is really a godsend to Nadine. She's finally able to tell someone about what she remembered that night in Sedona. Just talking about it with somebody is a cathartic experience for her. Here's what Nadine recalls during the regression. She knew they were coming. The dream she had that month prior was like a beacon calling her to Sedona. She had to go. She remembers the hand coming toward her. It's an odd grayish-green color. She's also able to recall the taller, stronger presence that was there. She believes that being tried to appear like the others, maybe to seem less aggressive or threatening, but that effect wears off. She sees that it's about 5 feet tall, brown in color, angular, wrinkly skin. She's really put off by its legs and joints as they appear to face backwards. It's wearing some kind of metal armor on its chest like it's a warrior or something, and Nadine finds this fucker just repulsive. It's directing the smaller gray beings who appear to be nothing more than automatons without minds or thoughts of their own. They're doing something to calm her, and she feels relief from that. And she can't recall an event quite like this before, but she does remember these smaller gray beings. They're familiar because she's been encountering them since childhood. And again, without touching her, that you remember their hands are underneath hers, but they're not actually touching. They're lifting her up and pushing her forward toward this bright light. What she vaguely recalled brushing across her face before are actually tree branches hitting her. They enter a large clearing, and the bright light fades and becomes more misty, more vaporous. The larger being is no longer present. She now sees a round, saucer-shaped metallic craft in front of her, at least 100 feet across. It resembles dull brushed stainless steel. A crack suddenly appears and creates an opening. She doesn't want to go in, but she has no say in the matter. Once inside, she sees another figure. This one's at least 7 feet tall, pasty white, smooth skin, skinny, strange, slanted black eyes. It's wearing some kind of a long coat or cape. This one is indifferent, like there's a job to do, and that's that. It's beside an unusual instrument panel and what looks like an examination table. Nadine knows that table's reserved for her. She's lying flat on her back now, and 3 of the smaller gray beings insert a hose-like instrument into her genitals. She feels cramping in her abdomen as they're sucking something out of her. To her immediate right, there's a female hybrid-looking figure assigned with the sole task of keeping Nadine calm. And she does this by using pressure points on her wrist and telepathically reassuring her that everything is going to be fine. Nadine also realizes this being doesn't actually want to be there, but she's forced to play this role. And they've also inserted something into her right breast. Nadine notes that she had breast implants at the time, and this draws quite a bit of attention from these entities. Instead of absolute terror, Nadine feels subdued, like she's been heavily drugged. It's at this point she realizes her father is in the same room. He's just off to her side and completely out of it. Nadine knows in this moment that this is not the first abduction experience for either of them. Nadine has another regression with Barbara the following month to try to uncover some more details about that other night back in 1968 when she and Mike saw the UFO and fell asleep. She recalls seeing a green light that changes to white. It's coming from holes in the bottom of the craft overhead. And they're excitedly following this thing, and the light grows brighter. The UFO is now directly in front of them, and they're standing outside of the car, observing this thing. Nadine now realizes they're in a completely different place. Instead of the road they should have been on, they're somewhere else now, in a much smaller, skinnier road with high grass or possibly corn stalks all around them. The UFO doesn't make a sound. It's dead still, hovering in the air about 50 feet in front of them. The white light is focused on Mike now, and he looks distorted, like his body is twisted. The light has small, shiny particles within it. Nadine's standing on the opposite side of the car, in the darkness, unable to move. She can tell Mike is absolutely terrified, but she's more or less numb. She does feel empathy for Mike, because she can't help him, but she's otherwise subdued. Several beings then approach and circle Mike. They seem very intent on him for the moment. Her next recollection is Mike's gone. The craft is still there, but the white light has dissipated into more of a misty gray. Nadine's just standing there, waiting outside in the dark. She's not alone. One of the beings is with her, again using pressure points on the inside of her elbow in order to keep her calm and complacent. Its 3 long fingers and thumb move slowly and deliberately. They feel like rubber on her bare skin. Nadine's perceived surroundings suddenly shift. She's inside of a dark room within the craft now, and she sees Mike on a metal-looking table in front of her. He's completely mad with fear at this point. He's desperately flailing and trying to hold his legs together. Several of the beings manage to pry his legs apart and insert what looks like a glass tube into his genitals and extract what she can only imagine as semen. They cut the heel of his foot open, insert what Nadine assumes is some kind of a computer chip, and use a light instrument of some kind to close his skin back up. She's just sitting on a chair next to him with her companion still with her, still pressing on her elbow and wrist. The effect this has, basically, it renders her unable to feel emotions. She's mentally present but disconnected at the same time. All she can do is really observe. And she notices another very tall, white-skinned being, like the one she described in Sedona, is present as well, and he's in charge. Barbara then brings Nadine's awareness back to returning to the car. It's dark, the lights are off, and the car's not running, they're just sitting inside of it. Mike's head is tilted back in his seat, but he slowly comes to, and they rush home to tell her parents. Now, years after their relationship had ended, Nadine learns through his sister that Mike was hospitalized for paranoid schizophrenia. He claimed that strange beings were coming into his apartment through the walls. Nadine's story is far from over, however. When I come back, I'm going to reveal the true scope of her experiences. Is she one of the many who claim to have had a lifetime of contact with extraterrestrial beings? Is our military involved or somehow responsible? Or is she confronting nothing more than her own troubled mind? That and more after this. Today's story comes from the book Evolution, Coming to Terms with the ET Presence. It was authored by Nadine Lalich and published earlier this year. She also co-authored a book with Barbara Lamb herself back in 2008 called Alien Experiences. Are you starting to see a theme here yet? Don't worry, we'll come back to that. I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but Nadine was only part of the first book's focus. They did document, however, 11 of her own separate encounters. 11. Not only is that number larger today, Nadine claims there's a whole host of other experiences that are either too disjointed, fuzzy, or incomplete to put to paper. Thankfully, I don't think it's really necessary to magnify every single account here. Let's distill it down instead. Since apples usually don't fall far from the tree, let's start with Dad. Nadine describes her father, Thomas, as an unusual but creative, highly intelligent man. The Air Force clocked his IQ at well over 150. He flew 52 missions in World War II and taught radio telegraphy and electronics at an Air Force command center. He didn't have an easy life as a kid during the Great Depression and ended up with PTSD from the war to boot. So not too surprising that he lacked certain social graces. He spent most of his free time alone working on projects in his basement or reading books. Tom's appetite for knowledge was insatiable. And when he did talk about the stuff he was into, sadly, his family kind of just learned to tune him out. It was over their heads. It was fairly common to hear him say things like, "I know I don't belong here," or "I wish they'd come back and take me off this planet." As a young man, his sisters would often find Tom in a trance, staring out of their second-story window into oblivion. This was worrisome as he had a habit of jumping out of the window and disappearing into the night. Whenever he'd leave, they'd go out and look for him right afterward, but never saw a sign of the guy. It was confounding. He'd always return a few hours later with no memory where he'd been. Aunt Patricia, on her mom's side, also claims to have had a visit from what sounds like Men in Black back in 1950. But that appears to be it in terms of weirdness in the family tree, as far as Nadine's aware. It's interesting, too, because if you think about it, right, Men in Black are a throwback to the 50s, so they must have made a really odd impression. The black sedan, the fedoras, the suits, they would have all been period correct at the time. Nadine's claims are many, but overall, the encounters have a theme, one many of us are familiar with. Repeated abduction scenarios spanning multiple generations within a family, curious off-world entities plucking people away and performing medical procedures and experiments usually related to the human reproduction system, alien hybrids and offspring, stolen fetuses, ETs fascinated with human emotion, showing up after a traumatic event or causing one to see how we'll respond to it, showing us doomsday slideshows where the Earth blows up or gets taken over by aliens, forcing humans to perform tests, absorbing information so it can be activated later, telepathy, screen memories, rooms full of human test subjects, implants and unexplained marks on the body, nosebleeds, strange and high-low frequency noises, various alien races like tall grays, short grays, reptilians, insectoids, tall whites, hybrids, men in black, all apparently working together within a hierarchy. Some are hive minds, some are aggressive and in charge. Time distortion, missing time, mind and body control, condescending asshole ETs telling us how life really is. Then there's the military aspect. In the second to last chapter of the book, Nadine talks about black helicopters, sometimes accompanied by or shape-shifting into UFOs, flying over her house, being taken to an underground secret military base inside of a mountain, an underwater base, humans, aliens, hybrids, and cloned super soldiers all conspiring together, re-engineering exotic crafts, interrogating abductees about what information they have. I'll be honest here. This is where I kind of begin to check out a little bit. I'm not saying these things aren't true. I didn't live Nadine's life, and I can't possibly understand it or validate it. But I think the idea of such a grand conspiracy between so many factions, and to keep such an operation on that scale a secret for so long, it all just sounds a little too Hollywood for me. I'm sorry. There's a lot of elements to her story that line up with other credible accounts out there. I just don't think it's wise to take them too literally. Every incident Nadine speaks about has strong parallels to dreams. I wouldn't go as far as saying that's all they are, but what do we really know about dreams? We have theories, but science doesn't have a definitive answer. The metaphysical I'm here but not here feeling, the sudden inexplicable changes in appearances or the environment falling in and out of awareness. Let's not forget, too, that much of what Nadine recalls came from hypnotic regression. Up until Sedona in 1991, she was only aware of the Elfman dream and the UFO she and her boyfriend witnessed. Later in life, she would go on to experience times in the middle of the day where she'd suddenly be overcome with exhaustion. She'd have no choice but to lay down and fall almost instantly into a deep sleep for hours. So it wasn't always at night, but sleep always had something to do with it. One might argue that sleep is a convenient tool for the abductors to use against us. Fair enough, but what if the realm in which we sleep is a real place? If so, can these entities step in and out of that environment at will? Or is that their natural habitat? Since people report both physical and non-physical elements, I think maybe it's possible we're dealing with something multidimensional in nature. And that's a fun word, but I don't think humans truly grasp that concept yet. Perhaps that's revealed to us when our physical bodies die. I don't know. In terms of the regression and hypnosis aspect here, I think it warrants some serious scrutiny. Here's the big problem. We're too open to suggestion, and we're playing with the subconscious, something we know dangerously little about. I had a hard time reading the transcripts of Barbara and Nadine's sessions. Many times her questions were leading and suggestive. Let's hear some examples. Nadine: we were sleeping. They opened up the back door and pulled me out. Barbara: and probably the van was locked, I would imagine. Barbara: is he with the little gray ones? Nadine: yes, he is. Barbara: okay, well, that's interesting to know. These different species do seem to collaborate. Nadine: I know I'm going to end up on that table. Barbara: does any of this seem familiar at all? Like you've been in this kind of a room with these unusual beings and seeing that table and being on that table ever? Does it ring a bell? Nadine: they try to make you believe it's the right thing and that it's okay. There's nothing okay about it. Barbara: yes, but they say things like that. Nadine: I don't ever remember anything like this. It's all you can do to accept it. Barbara: which of course is what they want you to do. What the hell? These are just a handful of examples, and not to mention Barbara has regressed thousands of other people. That is fucking scary. What kind of position is that for a so-called mental health practitioner to take? She sounds an awful lot more to me like a ufology fan that wants stories for her books than somebody who genuinely wants to help people find answers. Or maybe Barbara just chose a side of the fence to sit on and drink the Kool-Aid. Either way, where is the objectivity here? How incredibly irresponsible. Sadly, this is all pretty typical stuff for these specialists. Therefore, we cannot possibly know if these are real memories people are digging up, or if it's just the human brain scrambling to fill in blanks or appease someone else under suggestive direction. Maybe hypnosis would have more credibility if we could just allow people to be in a relaxed state and share what they want to share. Sure, some of us do that already, but it doesn't matter because the ones that don't ruin it for everybody. Obviously, it's Nadine's belief that she's been encountering ETs, and many would agree with her. But if you're in a controlled environment, though, exposed and vulnerable, is it really that hard to consider that she believes what someone wants her to believe? In fairness, Nadine does speak to this in the book. She wonders if past experiences influence future ones, especially these abduction scenarios. She's put a lot of thought into alternative explanations over the years, but she lands on the ET hypothesis time and again because her experiences support it. Look, people do see unexplained physical objects in our skies. And yes, it's hard to imagine human pilots would be in these things due to the physics involved. But how many people in the 1600s envisioned humans one day taking a fiery tin can into outer space or planting a flag on the moon? None. That's how many. I'm not really saying that's the case here. I don't actually believe that myself. I think there's very good possibilities that someone or something else could be responsible for a lot of the things we see out there. And we shouldn't aim to judge anyone here. I don't think that's productive. As consumers who buy her book, however, I think we're more than entitled to have a little discourse about its contents. I think Nadine's had an interesting life, but there's a lot of key components missing. Remember in the Elfman dream, she said she was experiencing emotional pain from past trauma in her childhood. She also says that was her earliest memory of an unusual encounter like that. So what happened to her before she was 10? What trauma is she referring to? She doesn't talk about that. Why? Is she referring to prior encounters that she can't consciously remember that she assumes she had? The way she talked about it suggests otherwise, but again, we don't know. It's not said, and it could be a significant detail. What about her dad, Tom? His behavior as a young man, staring out of the window in a daze, unresponsive, leaving through the window, returning hours later with no memory. That may be evidence of a sleep disorder, which could be hereditary. Nadine doesn't mention that possibility at all. Something else that really threw me. She believed her father was with her on that ship in Sedona. But as I understand it, he lived in Michigan at the time. Did Tom have an uncontrollable urge to drive to Sedona that night too? From Michigan? It's a little more than a road trip. Nothing's said about that either, and it's a major detail. Why did she physically have to be in Sedona at that time? Did they make a pit stop in Michigan first? If it's all the same to these hyper-technological interdimensional beings, why not go a few more miles, all things considered? How's physical proximity or distance a factor for metaphysical beings or their crafts? Were they flying a shitty rental that time that didn't have the optional hyperdrive upgrade or something? Forgive me for being a little facetious here, but this doesn't make any sense. Either Nadine forgot to connect some really big dots for the reader, or she's using the bizarre nature of these claims to her advantage by assuming people will resort to the, well, if this could happen, I suppose that could happen too, mode of thought. When someone makes extraordinary claims, especially when they sell them in a book, those claims demand and are subject to extraordinary scrutiny. Don't expect us to gloss over all the discrepancies and red flags. That's not how it works. I have no desire to either believe or debunk Nadine. I just want the whole story so I can possibly draw some of my own conclusions. And we're not getting the whole story. Her old boyfriend, Mike, another example. He was hospitalized. Okay, that's it? No follow-up? You'd think a shared experience of that magnitude would warrant a little more research. Why wouldn't Nadine do everything in her power to find this guy, sit down with him, hash it out, and try to get some kind of closure or validation for that experience? Did he die? Does he not want to be found? We just don't know. I'm not trying to say it's all bullshit. I do think that there is some sincerity in there somewhere. Nadine may have experienced some incredible things, and she did the best she could to make sense of them. But in doing so, she subjected herself to the likes of people like Barbara Lamb and a ridiculous culture of all-in believers and shysters. Of course, my suspicions could be wrong. Maybe everything happened as she described, but her memories are so jumbled and spotty that it's just not possible to articulate them in a linear fashion that makes any sense to us. She certainly wouldn't be the first to come forward with a narrative like this. I personally think there is something to the phenomenon in general. I doubt very much that so many credible, honest, hardworking people are all experiencing some shared mass delusion or hallucination. That's way harder to entertain than the claims themselves. Many scholars agree with that. Most experiencers don't write books or push a narrative, however. I think it's reasonable to say that most of them are afraid to tell even their closest friends and family. They're too confused, ashamed, and overall fearful of ridicule to share it with the world. Some of them quietly do their own research to try and understand it. Some shove it down in the deepest recesses of the mind so they don't have to deal with it. To come forward with information like this, you either have to be an exceptionally brave soul, someone in desperate need of medical help, or a liar. Which one Nadine happens to be isn't for me to say. We all need to look at stories like this and decide for ourselves. We have to ask the tough questions. We need to dissect the details with utmost vigilance. We have to compare the data to look for patterns and inconsistencies. We can't put a yes or no check mark next to each name. That's absurd. All we can do is interpret the info using the tools we have to try and discern what might be possible and what implications those present to us. Again, the book's called Evolution, Coming to Terms with the ET Presence. It's available on Amazon. And there's quite a lot in this book that didn't make the episode, so definitely go pick this up if you're inclined to learn more about Nadine's story. I'll include a link in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed the first episode of Season 3. Thank you guys so much for joining me. It's great to be back. Look for the Ether Podcast on Facebook and drop me a line if you have a story. We'll see you next time here in the Ether.